Mercedes might have just hidden its biggest weapon, hours before the first race of the season. Because inside the paddock in Melbourne, rival engineers started noticing something unusual in the Mercedes data traces. The W17 was not suddenly faster, but the way its engine was delivering power had clearly changed. Smoother launches, more controlled torque delivery, and a hybrid deployment pattern that looks very different from what we saw in Bahrain. And here is why that matters. During testing, Mercedes discovered a serious problem. Their race starts were terrible. Even George Russell admitted they were worse than any start he had experienced in Formula One. Which meant one thing. Even if the car had strong race pace, it could lose the race before the first corner. So Toto Wolff and the Mercedes engineers went back to work. Not to redesign the car, but to rewrite how the engine and hybrid system behave in the most critical seconds of the race. Torque maps, energy deployment, traction delivery, all recalibrated for the moment the lights go out. And if these changes work the way Mercedes expects, the W17 could suddenly become far more dangerous than it looked during testing. Because in Formula One, the biggest upgrades are not always visible. Sometimes, they are hidden in the software that controls the engine. And that may be exactly what Mercedes just brought to Australia. But the real story behind Mercedes in Australia begins with something most people did not notice during the Bahrain tests. The W17 looked fast. The car looked stable. And for the first time in several years, Mercedes drivers were not fighting a car that behaved unpredictably. But when engineers looked deeper into the data, they discovered a weakness that could destroy their entire race before it even started. The launch. During the practice starts in Bahrain, the Mercedes struggled badly when the lights went out. Too much wheel spin, unstable torque delivery, and inconsistent traction when the driver released the clutch. George Russell was unusually honest about it. He admitted that the practice starts he performed were worse than any start he had experienced in Formula One. And in modern Formula One, that problem can be catastrophic. Because the start of the race has become more important than ever. The cars are closer together. Aerodynamics are more sensitive. And losing 3 positions before the first corner can completely ruin the strategy for the rest of the race. That is exactly why Mercedes engineers immediately shifted their focus after the Bahrain tests. Not toward adding new aerodynamic parts. Not toward changing the overall concept of the car, but toward something far more complex. How the power unit delivers torque in the first 2 seconds of the race. When the 5 lights go out, 3 systems must work perfectly together. The internal combustion engine, the hybrid motor, and the traction management software that controls how power reaches the rear wheels. If those systems are not synchronized perfectly, the driver loses traction instantly. Too much torque, and the tires spin. Too little torque, and the car launches slowly. So between Bahrain and Australia, Mercedes engineers have been recalibrating how these systems interact. They adjusted the torque curves of the combustion engine. They modified how the electric motor supports acceleration during the launch phase. And they refined the ERS deployment logic so the energy release happens progressively rather than aggressively. In simple terms, they tried to smooth out the entire launch sequence. Because a smoother launch means more grip. More grip means better acceleration. And better acceleration means the driver can defend position into the first corner. But this change affects much more than just the start of the race. It also influences how the car behaves when exiting slow corners during the lap. And that is incredibly important in Melbourne. Albert Park has several corners where drivers slow down significantly before accelerating into long straight sections. If the power delivery is too aggressive, the rear tires can lose traction. If the power arrives more progressively, the driver can apply throttle earlier and maintain better control. Which means the work Mercedes has done on the engine maps may help them not only at the start of the race, but throughout the entire lap. And this is where another important detail enters the story. Because despite these improvements, Mercedes still faces a serious challenge heading into Australia. The competition. During the Bahrain tests, the Red Bull Ford power unit showed extremely strong efficiency in straight-line deployment. In several GPS comparisons, the Red Bull simply kept gaining speed toward the end of the straights. Ferrari also looked very competitive. Their new engine configuration delivered strong traction and very stable energy deployment during long runs. Which means Mercedes cannot rely on engine power alone. They must extract performance from the entire package. Aerodynamics, energy management, tire behavior, and race strategy. The good news for Mercedes is that the W17 already appears to be a much healthier car than the machines they struggled with during the early ground effect era. George Russell himself said something very revealing after the Bahrain tests. For the first time in years, the Mercedes does not feel fundamentally flawed. It feels like a car with real potential. That may sound simple, but inside Formula One, that statement carries enormous weight. Because when a team finally builds a car with a solid foundation, development becomes much easier. Engineers can focus on refining performance instead of fixing structural problems. And that is exactly the situation Mercedes now finds itself in. A car with strong fundamentals, an engine with theoretical potential, and a series of small but important refinements introduced just hours before the first race of the season. But there is still one big unknown: how all these elements will perform once the lights go out in Melbourne. Because the Australian Grand Prix often produces surprises, new cars, new regulations, and teams still discovering the limits of their machines. Which means the W17 could either confirm Mercedes' return to the front, or reveal that Red Bull and Ferrari still have the upper hand. And the answer to that question is now only hours away. But there is another layer to the Mercedes story that makes this situation even more fascinating just hours before the Australian Grand Prix. Because the problem with the W17 was never just about the engine. It was about how the entire car behaved when all systems worked together. During the Bahrain tests, Mercedes engineers finally saw something they had been chasing for years: a stable aerodynamic platform. For the first time since the beginning of the ground effect era, the Mercedes did not look nervous or unpredictable. The redesigned side pods, the tighter engine cover, and the heavily revised floor around the rear wheels created a much more balanced airflow structure across the car. That stability is extremely important. Because when the aerodynamic platform of a Formula One car is stable, engineers can push other areas of performance much further. They can run more aggressive engine maps. They can experiment with hybrid deployment. They can optimize tire management, without worrying that the car will suddenly become unstable at high speed. And that is exactly what Mercedes has been exploring between Bahrain and Australia. Because while most people focus on raw engine power, modern Formula One performance is actually controlled by energy strategy. Every lap is a constant balance between harvesting electrical energy and deploying it at the perfect moment. Deploy too early, and the battery is empty before the end of the straight. Deploy too late, and the driver loses the chance to attack or defend position. So the work Mercedes has done on the engine maps for Australia goes far beyond the race start. Engineers have been adjusting how the hybrid system releases energy across the entire lap. More progressive deployment out of slow corners, better energy recovery during braking zones, and smoother transitions between combustion power and electric boost. These changes may look small on paper, but they can dramatically change how the car behaves in traffic, which is something Mercedes struggled with in previous seasons. Because when the hybrid system delivers power too aggressively, the rear tires can lose grip when the driver accelerates out of corners. That not only slows the car down, it also increases tire degradation during long stints. So by smoothing the torque delivery, Mercedes hopes to achieve two things at the same time: better traction, and more consistent tire performance during the race. That combination could become extremely valuable at Albert Park, because Melbourne has evolved into a circuit where tire management plays a huge role. The asphalt is relatively smooth, but the corners demand repeated acceleration and braking, which constantly stresses the rear tires. If the power delivery of the Mercedes engine is now more controlled, the drivers may be able to protect their tires better over long runs. And that could become a major strategic advantage on Sunday. But despite all these improvements, Mercedes still enters the Australian Grand Prix with a certain level of caution. Because the competition looks extremely strong. Red Bull appears to have an incredibly efficient power unit with excellent straight-line deployment. Ferrari has introduced refined traction and hybrid management through its new engine configuration, which means Mercedes cannot afford mistakes, even small ones. And that brings us back to Toto Wolff. Because his message before the race has been surprisingly measured. No bold predictions. No claims of domination. Instead, a calm acknowledgement that the W17 is a solid foundation, but still a work in progress. And that may be the most important clue of all. Because throughout the history of Mercedes in Formula One, the team rarely arrives at the first race with its final form. They start with a strong base. They collect data. And then they develop aggressively as the season unfolds. Which means the car we are about to see in Melbourne may only be the beginning of Mercedes' real performance. The engine maps have been refined. The hybrid deployment has been adjusted. The aerodynamic platform finally looks stable. Now the only question that matters is simple. When the lights go out in Australia, will those changes be enough to challenge Red Bull and Ferrari at the very front? Because in just a few hours, the first Grand Prix of the season will reveal exactly where Mercedes truly stands. But there is one final detail about the Mercedes upgrades that very few people are discussing right now. And it could become the deciding factor of the entire Australian Grand Prix. Because when engineers inside Formula One talk about power units, they are not only talking about horsepower. They are talking about how efficiently that power is used over an entire lap. And that is where Mercedes believes the W17 may still have hidden potential. During the Bahrain tests, one pattern appeared repeatedly in the telemetry data. The Mercedes was strong in the middle of the straight. But toward the very end of the straight, some rivals appeared to maintain slightly better energy deployment. Especially Red Bull. In several GPS overlays, the Red Bull continued gaining speed during the final meters of the straight, suggesting extremely efficient energy management. For Mercedes engineers, that observation became a key area of focus before Australia. Because energy deployment in Formula One works like a limited resource. Each lap, the battery stores a specific amount of electrical energy. Engineers must decide exactly how that energy is used. Release too much early in the straight, and the boost disappears before the braking zone. Release it too slowly, and the driver never reaches maximum acceleration. The perfect solution is a carefully balanced deployment curve. And that is exactly what Mercedes has been recalibrating in the days leading up to the Australian Grand Prix. Instead of releasing the full electrical boost immediately, the system now spreads the deployment more progressively across the straight. That approach may reduce the dramatic acceleration spike at the beginning, but it maintains power for longer, which could allow the car to sustain higher speed toward the end of the straight. And if that works as intended, it could partially close the gap that appeared between Mercedes and Red Bull during testing. But the story does not end there. Because the hybrid system also affects something else that is critical in Melbourne. Overtaking. Under the current regulations, drivers rely heavily on hybrid deployment and overtake modes to pass rivals. The combustion engine alone is no longer enough to create a significant speed advantage. Instead, overtakes often depend on who has more electrical energy available at the right moment. That means a car with better energy efficiency can attack more often during the race, or defend more effectively when under pressure. And this is another area where Mercedes believes the new calibration could help. By improving how energy is harvested during braking zones, the car may recover slightly more electrical power throughout the lap. That additional energy could then be used during overtaking attempts, or during defensive moments when another driver activates their own overtake mode. These battles often happen in fractions of a second. But those fractions can decide positions, and positions decide races. Still, Mercedes is fully aware that none of these refinements guarantee victory in Australia. Because the competition at the front of the grid looks incredibly tight, Red Bull appears extremely efficient in energy deployment.